I want to talk to you about marks that we use in woodworking, and sometimes we use permanent lines, sometimes we use temporary lines, and sometimes they may not be obvious. If you're watching somebody that's doing woodworking like myself, you may have questions to ask of why we use a pencil line, why we use a knife wall, why we do different things. And I often want to say this is a temporary mark, and I often do say that this is a temporary mark. So if I've got my piece of wood and I want to lay this out for a dado or something like that, I take my my square and I take my pencil and I make a mark across, and then I take my second piece that's going to be inset into it, make another mark and set my line on there. Why didn't I just use 2 knife marks to do that with? Well, because those marks are permanent and I'm not ready yet for these to be permanent cut lines. So in other words, I put 2 lines on. In this case for the dado, I'm putting more lines temporarily on here, and these are serving as a guide for me to make more permanent marks. So in this case, you'll see that I'm going to run a gauge line, which is a permanent mark. Now, I could just run a pencil line with my finger like this, and that will give me the depth to cut to. If I keep that setting and switch to this side, I've got my mark, but it's not as decisive as the mark I might use with a marking gauge like this. So I've got this pin sharpened. Now, because I've got these 2 extreme points, I can run my gauge line in from one line to the next, knowing that the waste that's going to be removed is actually going to go to that line, and it'll be taken out. The waste wood will be taken out. So what I do now, to make everything else permanent, I go now with a permanent mark. So I'm going to go to the one line and run my knife wall into the gauge line, come up onto this face here, drop my knife into the nick and make a permanent line with the knife. So I go across here, from one side to the other. Here I've got the knife nick on the corner, so I drop my knife in there, and then I can pull my knife wall right up to the gauge line. Once I've done that, I might chisel down some there, but I might also now take my knife, put my square onto the knife wall, and then slide this one up to it and make a small nick in the surface here. And that gives me the exact distance. It's a perfect distance for the recess to go into. Now, there may be other techniques that I would use along with that, but this is just to show you why I've gone from pencil to a permanent knife wall. So those are the walls I will actually cut to, and the guide I've got from the pencil helped me to determine the start and stop of the permanent knife walls. But that's how that works. It works so well, very nicely. If I'm making, say, a mortise and tenon joint, let's take this one, for instance. I want my mortise and tenon joint in here. I can take my pencil either side of my tenon piece, run my square up against those pencil lines, and I can transfer everything over to the opposite face using pencil lines. Again, I've got exactly the same dilemma. I don't want permanent marks in here because those marks going across the faces there would show. Now, in times past, they might have used what we call a marking knife, which wasn't so much a knife blade like this one is. It would be a temporary blade, and so that's when we switch. That's when we didn't switch. We just ran a gauge line or a knife mark in place of the pencils we now have so readily available to us. So I set the stock, I've set the distance for my pins, and I can go right between the pencil lines again and stop right on that knife onto that pencil line, flip over, use the same registration face, and run my gauge lines. So there I have it. Now I go back. The first wall is going to be determined by wherever I place the square and make my knife wall. Watch what happens on the corner. Now I'm transferring to the other side. I make a single knife mark, Now I take my second piece of wood, offer it to the fence of the to the blade of the square. Now I've got a mark here, drop my knife into that knife nick and go between the two lines from the gauge again. A small nick on the corner. Knife goes into that nick because it will be so small it will barely be seen. And the same on this one. So knife goes right into the nick that I left on the corner. Make a small nick on that side. And I can transfer this exactly 90 degrees from one side to the other. And I've got my knife walls exactly where they need to be. Now you can see how that gives me those permanent marks. So I've got the permanent knives marks from my marking gauge or mortise gauge, and I've got the permanent marks from my knife walls. Now I can chop with impunity, knowing that from one side to the other it's going to be exactly between the lines. Erase the lines, keep them in, sand them out, whatever you want to. So that's why we have those permanent marks and the temporary ones, just to get us where we need to be. So here we've got a dovetail. I've got two pieces of wood. I'll just quickly lay this out with the pencil lines again. So I take my fingers at the tip of my fingers on the end grain of the long piece, and then I make a pencil line across. I could use the square, but do I need to? I don't really need to. Now what I'm going to do is I can lay out for dovetails here, and that will give me some long marks to work to, so I can use a dovetail template. Again, these are temporary, but these lines are actually the lines that I'm going to work to. So if I flip this, flip it, and then make my dovetail lines, I can go across the top with the square and square my lines across, just like this. And I've got my marks ready to cut to. I don't need them on that side. So if I cut these now, and I work to that temporary line and stop just above it, cut this one. So I've cut my dovetails by working to the lines. So in this case, these pencil lines are exactly what I want to work to. I don't use a knife because it's going along or with the grain. I don't need it for going with the grain. When I come to the cross grain cut, that's different. So I take my square, place it onto the wood, take my second piece, push this up with my fingertips flush against the end, and then in between the saw marks, those are the now permanent marks, I'm going across the temporary pencil line in between the saw curve where I'm going to remove the waste, and I can cut that knife wall all the way across the grain, and I can go on the inside as well. And in this case, I can make a permanent knife wall all the way across because it's an internal corner. So I can make all these evaluations all the time I'm working, what's permanent, what's temporary. Once I've done that, I can cut to this knife wall, remove the waste wood, and I've stayed within. When I take the eraser and take off the pencil lines, there will be no marks visible except where the joint lines are. So I'll have perfect shoulder lines, and I'll have knife walls that I've worked to that were permanent, and the temporary ones have been taken out. So sometimes we use a pencil line itself as a permanent line until, like in this case, I'm going to take this. This is where I might use a pencil line going along the grain. Now, there would be no point in using a knife on this because the grain is not parallel to that curve that I've just marked on the wood. So I'll use the pencil line as a permanent mark for me to cut this to, so I would either bandsaw to it or trim it with a chisel or whatever. So that's another that's become the permanent mark. That's the one I would work to. Sometimes we've got a piece of wood and it's too thick. Let's take this one for instance. We can use a marking gauge like this and set it to slightly less than we want. So I'm using the gauge here to gauge my line. I wouldn't generally use a pencil line to do this with. I've got the stock of the marking gauge that works very nicely up against the edge of the piece of wood. By the time I've gone around this, I've got my piece of wood ready to cut, ready to plane or saw down to thickness, and that's where I would use a marking gauge. Would I use something like this? What about this one? This is called a cutting gauge, or in some places it's called a slitting gauge, and it's got a variety of applications. Let's say I'd got my dovetails laid out on this piece of wood and I wanted to use a gauge to go across the grain. I can use a cutting gauge like this and go all the way across and cut a knife wall with that, which is much better. A lot of people will advocate that you use a marking gauge to put your gauge line across there. And one of the downsides of that is it's definitely bruising the wood. It's not cutting anything. If it's cutting anything, it's cutting and bruising, and that V point is going and it's making a groove in there, which is going to show after it's done. Now that could be in a variety of applications, not just for dovetails or for housing dados or for tenons or whatever. What's the difference then if I use a knife? Well, the knife is what severs the fibers. So what I'll do here is I'm going to run the knife wall here. I take a very light pass at first, then I go very heavily. And this is actually severing the fibers, which is its greatest advantage, because this gives me a wall. It's a very definitive wall, it's unquestionable. And by the time I've cut this, I'm going to cross-cut this. And by the time I've cross-cut this, I'll have a knife wall all the way around that's actually, it's going to be about a 1/16 of an inch deep. Second pass takes it deeper. So I've got my knife wall, and now I can cross-cut this with a saw, and I'm just going to take a chisel and watch what happens here. You can watch the chisel go into the wood, and what this does, it defines the knife wall with a very vertical wall just on this one side. So if I flick this away, I've got this permanent wall that's cross-cut the grain. Now if I go, I can slip my saw right up against that knife wall. I've got my knife wall established very deeply. Now I've got a sawn wall, which is to that knife wall. Drop my hand to the knife wall, following the knife wall the whole time. And that gives me a confidence that I'm cutting to that knife wall the whole time. So I'm listening for the fibers, I'm listening for how the saw is responding in the wood. And what that did, on the underside, I don't have any tear out. I've left this rather full so you can see what I'm doing, but I'm going to plane this down now. So I take my chisel, and I've got a knife wall all the way around. And I take this down at a bevel. So I'll show you what I've got. I'll give you a picture so I can see where I've planed, and I've got my knife wall here. This midsection in between the four walls is now high, so I back my plane iron off, and I'm using that knife wall constantly as my reference so I can see exactly where this is going to. I'm looking on the end grain for the knife wall, and by the time I've planed this, I'll be able to show you exactly where the knife wall is. Notice I didn't cut on the outcut because it would break off these outer edges. So there, I've got it. Those end grain fibers are causing the harmonic. So now I can see a very definitive knife wall right around the edge all the way around. I can see it very clearly, And that's got me exactly where I want to be. So that's the permanent knife wall that I use as my guide to work to and plane to, and that's how I get things dead square.